What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds fun to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. On the other hand, if you're not into the combination, that's fine. There's some links for you down in the description, but for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Okay, so according to my channel analytics, or dare I say, channelytics. Sorry, according to what I can see on the back end, the logistical end of my channel, it appears as though most of us, like over half of us, we all grew up roughly around the same time frame. Millennials, unite. FYI, this is how you make a hand heart. Not this shit. Who came up with this? Even Apple reps the millennial hand heart, so take that, Gen Z. Anyway, like I said, it appears as though most of us here grew up throughout the 80s and 90s, the pre-social media, pre-cell phones, home with the streetlights era, the hanging out on these death traps era. An era that I feel as though we look back on fondly as a simpler, happier, and safer era. That said though, the more I cover these cases and the more I look back on this time frame, the more I'm starting to wonder if, over time, have we gilded these memories to be shinier than they truly were? Was it really safer back then? Like, actually? Or did we just perceive it to be safer? Because, for starters, we were children, so we didn't know squat about the real world. And two, we had so much less access to information back then compared to what's available at our fingertips 24/7 now. So was it more of an ignorance is bliss effect rather than the world actually being a safer place? Because I'm here to tell you, while we were out terrorizing our subdivisions and narrowly escaping electrocution, hanging out on literal electrical transformers all around the entire world, terrible shit was absolutely happening on a damn near daily basis. And that includes, but is certainly not limited to, the tragic story we are going to be covering here today. Today we're going to be covering the horrific and landmark case of the abduction and murder of Sarah Payne. This story has been highly requested for quite a while now, so if everyone could please join me in extending a heartfelt thank you to our friend Dino for bringing this case to us today, I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dino. Oh, and I hope that foot's doing better. All right, friends, grab your umbrellas and your teacups, because we're headed abroad today to jolly old England.
London, baby!
Actually, we're not headed to London at all today. Rather, we're headed about 50 miles south to West Sussex, which sits on just under 800 square miles of land located in southeast England. West Sussex as a whole is then subdivided into 7 individual districts, cumulatively hosting a population of roughly 892,000 people. Like most of England, West Sussex has a ton of beautiful parks and nature preserves. I think I saw the word harbor a few times, so lots of really nice harbors, I guess. Then, of course, there's no shortage of churches, castles, colleges, lots of Gothic, Victorian, and Queen Anne style architecture. And apparently, quite a few windmills. Hopefully, all of that helps to paint a word picture for you of where today's absolutely terrible story takes place. Sarah Evelyn Isabel Payne was born on October 13th, 1991 to her parents Sarah and Michael. Sarah was one of the couple's 4 total children. First came her oldest brother Lee, followed then by the couple's second son Luke. Then came Sarah, before finally her little sister Charlotte came along, thus completing Payne party of 6. By the way, I know I just blathered on about West Sussex for probably too long, and that is where the actual crime in today's story takes place. However, as far as day-to-day life went for the Payne family, they actually lived in Surrey, England. Basically smack in the middle of London and West Sussex. And Surrey, like West Sussex, is broken down into separate districts. Surrey has 11 of them, though. Then as far as Sarah and her family, specifically, they lived in the Elmbridge borough. And growing up, Sarah was, I feel like, just your average, typical little girl. She was into all the stereotypical little girl stuff. Just bows and dresses, dolls and pink and fairies and sparkles and rainbows. She loved all of it. And remember, she was Sarah and Michael's first little girl. So after 5 years of trucks and dinosaurs and blue. The Paynes were absolutely loving this change of pace. It was new, it was fun, it was exciting. Not to mention that Sarah was cute as an absolute freaking button. Hello? Are you kidding? And then on top of that, she was every bit as sweet as she was cute. Sarah was kind, she was caring, she adored her family, and she wanted nothing more than to just play day in and day out with her siblings. Sure, she was shy and timid when it came to being around strangers, but once you got to know Sarah, that was when her bubbly and energetic, playful side came out. And this side of Sarah could and would win over anyone that was ever lucky enough to get to know her. Unfortunately, though, the number of people who would get to know Sarah throughout her life was very seriously limited. And that is because at just 8 years old, 3.5 months before her 9th birthday, Sarah Payne was abducted. She was plucked right off of her grandparents' property, never to be seen alive ever again. And sadly, my friends, that brings us to July Y2K. So it was the first weekend in July 1st, actually. The weather was beautiful. Summer was in full swing, and the Payne family was looking to shake up their routine and head to the coast. So they packed up their things, they packed up their kids, and they headed off to West Sussex. They chose West Sussex specifically because Michael's father, Terry, and his second wife, Leslie, they lived on a big plot of land on this cute little country road near Littlehampton. It was the perfect place for the kids to run around and blow off steam, and for the parents to kind of catch a break, you know? You know how being at the grandparents' house with your kids is.
Yeah. Do you want to help? Not really. Okay.
Truly, though, this was just supposed to be a wholesome, relaxing, fun family weekend away. No one ever could have imagined that that weekend would change the lives of every single person in the Payne family forever. It was about 5:30 in the evening when Sarah and her family arrived at Terry's house, and as soon as those little feet hit the ground, they were raring to go. All 8 of them. 8 little feet, 4 kids.
I'm a mathaholic.
And 4 kids plus a long car ride, 1 + 1 = 2. Those kids were ready to have some fun. Pretty much as soon as they got there and they got settled, everyone except for Terry's wife Leslie headed down to the beach to take the family dog on a walk. And the group stayed together for a while. However, as Terry and the adults were chatting and Terry was telling Sarah and Michael all about a friend's house that he'd just finished helping paint, the kids were starting to get a little restless. While the adults were enjoying a nice, docile little jaunt on the beach, the kids, undoubtedly, wanted to run around like crazy, as kids do be doing. So when Terry suggested that the adults go and take a look at his friend's house, this is where the children and the adults decided to part ways. After all, Sarah and Michael were perfectly comfortable with this area. They had been here plenty of times, and they saw no reason that their children couldn't wander off a little and go play together. In fact, they were happy for them to roam around and to have a little fun, as long as they all stayed together and as long as Lee and Luke promised not to separate from the girls. The boys were 12 and 13 at this point, so I think it's reasonable to assume that they could handle watching the girls right around their grandparents' house for an hour or so. The girls were 6 and 9. It's not like they were sending the boys off with infants or toddlers. Plus, this is a rural, calm, sweet little country road. They didn't turn them loose in Miami or Detroit. To my knowledge, of all of the time that Terry and Leslie had lived in that house on that road, the couple had never experienced a single issue. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to think that allowing this would be a terrible mistake. And so, without really giving it much of a second thought, Sarah and Michael reminded their children of the rules. They told them to be safe, to stay together and not separate. And with that, the children took off from the beach, heading straight for a field near their grandparents' house where they were planning to go play. Now, technically, the field wasn't any sort of designated play area. However, there was a rope swing and some logs on the property that did seem to attract local children. So naturally, the Payne children believed that this would be the perfect place to go and play. And I believe they headed off in that direction sometime between 7:15 and 7:30 p.m. Now, at first, everything was fine. The kids were having fun. They were getting along, playing some sort of variation of hide and seek. Mind you, they were playing in a cornfield, so to me this sounds terrifying, but to each their own. Things didn't start to go awry, if you will, until a little bit into the game when Lee accidentally knocked Sarah down, and this caused her to bump her head, and obviously afterwards she was extremely upset. And Lee tried to console her, he tried to apologize for what had happened, but Sarah, I guess, was so upset that she just decided she wanted to head back to her grandparents' house. She was done playing, she just wanted to go. Again, Lee tried to stop her, and he tried to cheer her up to get her to keep playing, but evidently she was having none of it. And then, sadly, it wasn't until Sarah was like halfway back to the house that Luke noticed her, and he then tried to catch up with her to keep her from getting out of his sight. Because remember, one of their parents' biggest rules was to never separate from one another. So he ran after her and he told her to wait for him, but she had too much of a head start on him, and once she took off running, she managed to get through like these divider hedges. If I'm not mistaken, the hedges were between Terry and Leslie's house and the field that the kids were playing in. Like, if you stood at the right spot at the house, you could have easily seen the kids playing where they were. However, from where Luke was, by the time that Sarah got through the gap in the hedges, she was totally and completely out of range of where her siblings could see. That said, though, Luke, despite losing sight of his sister, he did keep running, hoping to catch back up with her and to get her to return safely back with the rest of them. But when he finally passed through the gap in the hedges, Sarah was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the next thing that either of Sarah's brothers saw was when Lee, completely unbeknownst to him, of course, saw the man that would ultimately rob he and his family of Sarah. As Luke had popped through the gap in the hedges and began searching for Sarah, obviously not finding her, on the other side of the field, more near the road, Lee did happen to see a, quote, scruffy-looking man drive past him in a white van that he said was similar to a transit, only it was longer and it didn't have any back windows. Lee described the man as looking kind of dirty, like a mechanic that hadn't showered in weeks. Like I said, he referred to him as scruffy. According to Lee, the man had kind of scraggly grayish hair, and he'd been wearing a red checkered shirt over a white t-shirt. At this description really is pretty incredible when you take into account that when Lee first saw this man, he had absolutely no idea that there was any significance to him at all. He had no idea that the creepy man in this creepy van driving past him and smiling and waving at him had anything to do with his sister's disappearance. At this point, he didn't even know his sister was missing. He probably just figured she'd made her way back to the house and that they'd see her in a little bit. So for him to remember the man in as much detail as he did, bravo to Lee. I can't even imagine how haunting it is for him to know that not only did this man drive past him with his sister hostage in the back of the van, but that this absolute fucking creep waved and smiled at him like he was just a friendly old neighbor. The fact that this actual monster was able to completely conceal himself behind this veil of normalcy, he quite literally encompasses the very definition of a wolf in sheep's clothing. And I'm sure as I'm sitting here discussing this man, you're probably wondering who he actually is. Roy William Whiting was born on January 26th, 1959 in Horsham, which is one of West Sussex's 7 districts, located right on the edge of the Weald in West Sussex. And if I may just take a second here to extend a preemptive apology to my friends across the pond. I am so sorry if I mess up any of these locations or how to pronounce them or their relativity to one another. I promise I am really trying. I am doing my best, but even with Google, I am over here sweating that I'm just fucking it all the way up. US cases, I'm mostly confident in my descriptions of places and their relativity to one another and so on and so forth. But oh my God, I step foot out of the US and I am just completely geographically challenged. I don't know anything.
I got nothing.
At any rate, for most of Roy's life, he lived and grew up in Crawley, which is another one of West Sussex districts. Crawley is right up at the tippy top, just east of Horsham. Roy was one of 6 total children born to his parents, George and Pamela. However, sadly, only he and 2 of his siblings actually made it past infancy. I'll tell you what, though, it's a real shame that he was one of the ones that made it. Is that mean to say? Probably, but I don't really care because this guy is just repulsive. Don't get me wrong, for a while he seemed sort of normal, I guess. I mean, he wasn't a very good student, therefore he never got any real employment qualifications under his belt, so he basically just worked odd jobs throughout most of his life. But he got married in the 80s, he had a kid, got divorced, had another kid. At one point, he even tried to get into motorsports. Specifically, he tried his hand at banger racing. And although he really gave this his all over the course of his 20s and 30s, big fat bummer for Roy, he was never really able to see much, if any, success within the sport. And so once he came to terms with that, he decided to shift his hobby from motorsports to pedophilia. Yeah, if that's not one of the fucking craziest pivots you've ever heard of, I don't know what is, but Roy sure did go for it. So this is recorded to have started in 95 when Roy kidnapped and sexually assaulted an 8-year-old girl, for which he was ultimately sentenced to 4 years in prison. Now, the maximum possible sentence for this crime was life. However, Roy managed to squeak off with a lesser sentence because he had voluntarily chosen to plead guilty. What's absolutely balls to the walls fucking banana nut muffin crazy, though, is that a psychiatrist who assessed Roy after his conviction determined that he was highly likely to reoffend. And even so, Homeboy was still released from prison in November of 97 after serving just 2 years and 5 months of this 4-year sentence. And the only reason he had to serve those extra 5 months was because he refused to participate in a sex offender rehabilitation program. Yeah, definitely let him out. Seems like he's really trying. He was one of the first people put on Britain's sex offender register, but as we'll see moving forward, that didn't really matter much at all at the time. And in less than 3 years following his release, just as his psychiatrist had predicted, Roy in fact did reoffend. He snatched 8-year-old Sarah Payne right off the street, just yards away from her beloved grandparents' house. And while we know that to be what happened, initially after realizing that Sarah was missing, her having been abducted wasn't even the initial conclusion that people drew. Rather, at first, people assumed that she had just stormed off. Obviously, we know she was upset about whatever had happened between she and Lee, so people kind of figured she'd stormed off, gotten herself turned around somehow in the thick cornfields they were in. And I mean, sure, it was scary, but they assumed that she'd be found rather quickly. I think the only person that was weary of this assumption at first was Sarah's mom. Because by her own words, Sarah was not the type of child to, quote, scramble through ditches or hedges. And she even added on to this that during outdoor excursions, Luke or Lee would always have to beat down weeds or tall grass in order to clear a path for Sarah before she'd even think about walking through somewhere. So when Luke, Lee, and Charlotte ran back to the house without Sarah, and then Terry informed Michael and Sarah that Sarah was missing, I mean, distraught would be an understatement. She and Michael immediately jumped straight into action, and they began scouring through the field and the surrounding area. They left no stone unturned. They were screaming Sarah's name, asking every person they encountered throughout their search if perhaps they had seen Sarah. In an interview that she participated in much, much later, Sarah's mom said that by the time they actually gave in and called police, they had amassed a volunteer search party of close to 100 people. And these volunteers were simply just people that they had come across during their own search, who had then, out of the kindness of their hearts, dropped whatever they'd been doing to join the search in hopes of hopefully bringing Sarah home safely. But as time ticked on and there was still no sign of Sarah, her parents were forced to face the fact that they likely weren't going to find Sarah on their own, and at this point, it was time to turn the search over to the proper authorities. And so, just shy of the 2-hour mark, Sarah Sr., Sarah's mom. Sorry, I know it's confusing that they're both named Sarah, but nevertheless, Sarah's mother, Sarah, broke down and called 999 to formally report her daughter missing. And making this call was a massive gut punch to Sarah. Because the whole time they were searching for Sarah prior to this call, sure, it was scary and unsettling that she couldn't find her daughter, but calling the police, that was admitting and acknowledging how serious what was happening actually was. It was them admitting that the situation had gotten so serious that they couldn't handle it themselves. It all really hit Sarah in that moment that this was all really happening. Thankfully, though, police's response to Sarah's disappearance was incredibly quick and incredibly heavy. Within just 30 minutes of Sarah's call, dozens of police officers, as well as sniffer dogs and helicopters, joined the already massive search party that was out scouring the area, looking for Sarah. And while searching a field might sound easy, I assure you, it was not. This wasn't just like a vast, grassy, open field that you could see clear from one end to the other. No. This was an exhaustive search over tough terrain covered in incredibly dense crops, and although we know that she wasn't, Sarah could very well have easily been injured or hiding somewhere in that area, and it still would have taken them quite a while to find her. Thankfully, though, this search was a task that police as well as volunteers were more than willing to take on. For days, these people absolutely tore apart the field and the surrounding scrubland, just all to no avail. Meanwhile, as these searches wore on, Sarah's parents made numerous media statements and media appearances via either TV or printed media, just desperately appealing for her safe return and begging the nation to please keep their eyes peeled for their missing little girl. And although the general consensus at first was that Sarah had likely wandered off on her own volition, police outside the immediate foot search of Sarah did eventually begin a wider scale investigation into her disappearance, just on the off chance that she had fallen victim to foul play. And I say off chance because statistically speaking, it was unlikely to assume that Sarah had been kidnapped by a stranger, since stranger abductions only account for a very small percentage of missing children. However, obviously we know that, devastatingly, this time around, Sarah did in fact fall into that percentage. And here's where I'm really gonna blow your hair back. Guess who police interviewed only 24 hours after Sarah had gone missing? Did you guess Roy Whiting? If so, ding ding ding, we have a winner. Winner being you for guessing correctly, not Roy. He is absolutely a big fucking loser. A loser who, on the evening of July 2nd, 2000, officers from Sussex Police visited at his seafront flat in Little Hampton as part of their investigation into Sarah's disappearance. And this wasn't due to any sort of suspicion pointed specifically at Roy. At this point, they were only there to talk to him because he happened to be one of the very few sex offenders that were in close enough proximity to where Sarah was last seen to at least be worth a conversation. Little did they know just how on the right track they truly were. And Roy certainly did not do himself any favors or help himself in any way to squelch any interest police might have had in him. To put it mildly, a homeboy did not make a good first impression. When he was speaking with police regarding Sarah's disappearance, he was cold and emotionless and he really did not seem bothered or like he cared at all that this poor little girl was missing. The entire nation was seemingly completely distraught and demanding authorities to bring this little girl home. But Roy, it was like they were asking him questions about a missing pencil. Just zero sense of urgency or empathy or humanity when speaking of Sarah. And although Roy didn't directly incriminate himself, so to speak, throughout the course of the initial conversation, for some reason, when leaving his home, the officers that had come to question him just could not shake the feeling that something was up with Roy. So although he claimed to have nothing to do with Sarah's disappearance, even going so far as to provide police an alibi, for some reason, a reason they couldn't necessarily pinpoint, but there was just something about him and something about that conversation that made them feel as though they needed to stick around. They felt like they needed to keep an eye on the place, and more specifically, they felt like they needed to keep an eye on Roy. And wouldn't you know it, sure enough, Roy was quickly able to deliver them yet another hot, steaming helping of suspicion. So by this point, all of Sarah's family had been spoken to. Obviously, they'd all given their statements, they'd all walked police point by point through their perspective on their experiences and what they had seen the night that Sarah went missing. Police knew what she was wearing, where they were playing, right down to the creepy man in the white van that Lee had seen driving away from the area mere seconds after he'd lost sight of his sister. So imagine police's surprise and, discussed when they were surveying Roy Whiting and they saw him exit his flat and start rummaging around in his vehicle, which just so happened to match the exact description of the vehicle that Lee saw speed away from the scene of Sarah's disappearance. And in seeing this, police were like, fucking game on, baby. They get out of their cruiser. They walk back over to Roy. He's like waist deep into his van, digging around for God knows what, when they tap on the hood and ask him like, "Hey, what you doing?" To which Roy, undoubtedly caught off guard, was just like, "Yeah, nothing." And then, like a gift from above, a receipt, I believe it was a gas station receipt, a petrol station receipt. Sorry, I gotta stop. But this receipt, it falls out of his van, and when police pick it up and examine it, it just so happens to totally and completely negate the alibi that Roy had provided them just like minutes earlier. I guess Roy had claimed that he'd been at a fun fair in Mauve the evening that Sarah disappeared, and that he'd returned to his flat by 9:30 p.m. However, this receipt they were looking at, it proved that he'd actually been filling up his van with diesel at Buck Barn Garage near Pulborough. So like roughly an hour or 30-mile discrepancy in where he had claimed to have been.
Uh-oh.
Because like, for the most part, you're probably only going to need to fabricate an alibi, like Roy had, if you possibly, maybe, allegedly, probably have something pretty serious that you're trying to hide. And so, right then and there, acting completely on instinct, police actually arrested Roy Whiting on suspicion of kidnapping, based solely on his now debunked alibi. And devastatingly, as all of this was going on, the theory of what had happened to Sarah started to shift more seriously and more certainly to abduction. And poor Michael and Sarah, police actually began urging them to prepare for the worst, because it was becoming more and more likely with each passing moment that Sarah was probably not going to be found alive and well. And oh my God, I cannot even imagine anything more soul-crushing to hear. To be told that more likely than not, your child has been killed, it makes me physically ill. Like, I cannot even try to put myself in that position, because I think I would literally throw up. How do you even keep going after that? Not to mention that all the while, police were rapidly running out of time before they were going to be legally obligated to cut Roy loose from their custody. Based on what I could find, it looks like police in the UK have anywhere from like 3 to 4 days that they can hold someone before they either have to have enough evidence to formally charge them, or like in Roy's case, they have to let them go. And unfortunately, no matter how hard police tried to talk to Roy and tried to get the real story out of him, basically every question they asked him, he met them back with one single response, which was simply no comment. So whether they liked it or not, when those 3 days had come and gone, police were forced to release Roy due to a lack of evidence. Ugh, ew, it gives me the willies to think how those officers felt opening the doors and letting this man walk free when they basically knew that he was probably responsible for what had happened to this poor little girl. How disheartening must that have been? I mean, obviously they didn't send him ambiguously out into the abyss. They had every intention of keeping a very close eye on him. But before we get into that, I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, surveillance of Roy Whiting, as well as the investigation into Sarah's disappearance, both get kicked into high gear. Don't go nowhere. All right, so we're back, and just before our break, I mentioned that although police were planning to keep many eyes on Roy 24/7 following his release, they were still incredibly weary about cutting him loose, considering how sure they felt that he had to have been involved in Sarah's disappearance. And I totally get that, because, I mean, I know the situation I'm about to reference happened long after this situation did, but I think if the whole Brian Laundrie situation has taught us anything, it's that sometimes surveillance on a suspect or a person of interest isn't the safety net we all like to believe that it is. So even with 24-hour surveillance, it's still nauseating to know that police were forced to turn this maniac back out free onto the streets. I mean, this case is nuts if you really take a second to think about it. You had massive droves of police and civilians searching like the 30-mile radius around where Sarah had been abducted. You had teams of officers surveying Roy Whiting. There were police tasked with following up on additional tips and leads, of which there were no shortage. Sarah's face was on every newspaper, magazine, news broadcast, nationwide, pretty much. Investigative teams even filmed a recreation of Sarah's disappearance and broadcast it in hopes of garnering more information. Like, I will give credit where credit is due. They truly went in on trying to find this little girl. And rightfully so. I wish everyone, especially every child that went missing, got effort of this caliber put into searching for them. Heartbreakingly, though, in this particular case, no amount of effort in the entire world was going to be able to change the horrific outcome of what had happened to little Sarah. It was July 17th, 2000, 16 days after Sarah had initially gone missing, when a body was found in a field near Pulborough, West Sussex, roughly about 15 miles from where Sarah had last been seen. The body was, in fact, that of a little girl. She was found undressed and abandoned in a shallow grave at the edge of a field located near the A29. The body had been discovered by a farm worker who had been clearing ragwort from a field along the roadside. And when he first discovered the body, he actually thought it might be a deer carcass, but upon further examination, he very quickly realized that it was not. Once police retrieved the body, it was confirmed the following day on July 18th that it was in fact that of 8-year-old Sarah Payne. Unfortunately, due to Sarah's body's advanced stage of decomposition, it was nearly impossible for medical examiners to determine what exactly had happened to her. By the time her body was found, several of her limbs were actually detached. Her feet had been horribly disfigured, assumably by animals. And while they couldn't determine for sure if Sarah had been sexually assaulted, the pathologist did note that they couldn't exclude it as a possibility. Personally, I think given the fact that Sarah was discovered nude with a decent portion of her hair ripped out, I think we can safely assume that Roy kidnapped Sarah before violently sexually assaulting and murdering her. Again, it couldn't be determined with absolute certainty what her cause of death was. However, I think it's widely assumed that the most likely cause of death was asphyxia via either strangulation or suffocation. It is just truly unbelievable to me that people can do this to one another, let alone to an innocent child. I honestly, I just can't even begin to comprehend it. And finding out all of this, it was devastating to the Payne family, obviously. I mean, that much should go without saying. But the impact that Sarah's death had on the UK as a whole, I mean, if nothing else, it is heartwarming to see just how many people truly had been holding out so much hope that Sarah would return home safely, and how many people she had managed to affect without ever even actually meeting them. In the wake of Sarah's discovery, people flooded the A29 with flowers and toys and ribbons and candles, crosses, just all to honor this poor little girl that, although they'd never met, this little girl had impacted their lives in such a huge and indescribable way. And actually, it was one of these mourners who, just 3 days after Sarah's body was discovered, ended up finding her shoe and turning it over to police, which was huge. And while what happened is obviously horrific, the amount of support that people poured out of themselves for Sarah and for her family, that specific part of this story, I find to be kind of beautiful. Hundreds of people ended up turning up to Sarah's funeral. In fact, there were so many people in attendance that the church couldn't even fit all of them in. People ended up having to line the streets and the sidewalks leading up to the church just to be there to mourn for Sarah's loss. People were so horrified and furious that something like this could happen. They not only wanted justice, but they wanted harsh and swift justice as well. Whoever was responsible for the atrocities Sarah endured, people wanted them found and they wanted them punished to the most extreme extent the law would allow. And regrettably, that does bring us back around to crusty old dusty-ass Roy. After his initial arrest, Roy had actually chosen not to return to his flat in Littlehampton, where police had initially questioned and detained him. Rather, he chose to head almost an hour northeast back to Crawley, where he then went to temporarily stay with his father. Unfortunately, though, for Roy, he makes very bad decisions. It was July 23rd, 2000, when Roy once again found himself being pursued by police after he had decided to steal a car while under hefty surveillance. Roy then proceeded to go on a high-speed chase with police in said stolen car. Wait, 113 kilometers per hour. This whole time I'm out here thinking it's 113 miles an hour? I don't even know what that converts to. Hey Siri, what's 113 kilometers an hour converted to miles per hour? 70 miles per hour. That's it. Okay, so he stole a car and he went on a drive with police behind him. Scratch that whole high-speed chase thing. Am I a jackass? I don't feel like 70 miles an hour sounds that fast for a car chase, right? Truly, that sounds like it's only like a notch or two above the whole OJ Bronco cruise. At any rate, none of this really matters because eventually Roy lost control of the vehicle and he ended up wrecking into a parked car, which ultimately led to his arrest. He was charged with dangerous driving, and after pleading guilty in September of 2000, he ended up sentenced to 22 months in jail. And while 22 months, given what we know he did to Sarah, is like a drop in the freaking bucket compared to what he deserved, frankly, people like him belong under the jail, if you catch my drift. Because although I'm not typically a proponent for the death penalty, if you can hurt children, if you can hurt animals, even if you can hurt the elderly, I don't know, if you can hurt the most vulnerable populations there are, I personally don't believe that people like that can ever be rehabilitated fully. Nevertheless, though, buying themselves these 22 months, police could breathe a lot easier now, knowing that at least while they pursued Sarah's case and built up evidence against Roy, there was not a chance in hell that he would be able to hurt another innocent child in the meantime. Circumstantially, yes, police were pretty sure, based on Roy's gas receipt, that he had been in the area where Sarah's body was dumped the night she disappeared. However, that said, we can all understand that in order to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this man was guilty, they were going to need a hell of a lot more than just that receipt. And so, in hopes of finding just that, police ordered a full forensic sweep of Roy's vehicle, of his flat, and I believe also of his father's flat, since he'd been temporarily staying with him following his release in July. But I'm not sure about his dad's place, so I guess don't quote me on that part. His flat and the van, though, for sure. Roy had owned his 1988 white Fiat Ducato van for just 8 days before Sarah had gone missing. And when police searched through said van, they were able to find a single strand of long blonde hair, which obviously didn't belong to Roy, and ultimately, via DNA comparison, was determined to be Sarah's. This hair had been found entangled in a red sweatshirt of Roy's, which evidently at some point had come into contact with Sarah following her abduction. And while I personally believe that the hair was probably the most damning piece of evidence they found, overall, police were able to pull 22 matching fibers from Roy's van and Sarah's shoe, proving pretty convincingly that Roy Whiting had in fact been responsible for the abduction and the murder of Sarah Payne, which we knew because I gave that information up really early, but now police were able to prove it in a court of law. And finally, on February 6th, 2001, 7 long months after Sarah's disappearance, Roy Whiting was officially charged with her abduction and with her murder. Not surprisingly, Roy pled not guilty to both of his charges. Obviously, we know that that plea is bullshit, so thankfully, following entering his plea, he was then remanded back into custody, because if you'll remember, at the time, he was still in the process of serving out his reckless driving sentence. Roy's trial began on November 14th, 2001, and to say that tensions at Lewes Crown Court were high, that would be a massive understatement. People were outraged. People were devastated. Emotions were all over the map that day. Of course, Sarah's family was dealing with the hardest emotions, knowing that this was the day that they were going to have to come face to face with the man who had killed their little girl, the man who had taken their sister from them. This monster in the shadows was about to be paraded in front of them, and about to just come screaming into their reality. Sarah's mom has later said in interviews that just the thought of having to look at this man made her physically ill. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She was regularly vomiting. I believe she also said she took up smoking. Like, she was truly hanging on by a thread by the time this trial started. And I mean, she wasn't the only one. Honestly, the whole family was in the same boat. And as soon as the trial began, it was painfully clear that Roy Whiting could not have possibly cared any less about what he had done to Sarah and, in turn, what he had put her family through. He was cold and emotionless throughout basically the entire duration of the trial, never so much as even looking at Sarah's family or even acknowledging their presence, which is just so cowardly. You thought you were all big and bad when you kidnapped and murdered this little girl, but now you can't so much as look at the family whose lives you have obliterated. What a loser. Now, unfortunately, even with as open and shut as this case may seem to us, looking back in hindsight, at the time, the prosecution did have a bit of a task ahead of them in proving Roy's guilt beyond any sort of reasonable doubt. Because while you and I know that this was not his first offense and that he was at this point a well-vetted creepo, going into Roy's trial, the prosecution was actually barred from bringing up Roy's previous charges and previous convictions in any way. I guess the fear was that if he was convicted, Roy could possibly argue for an appeal on the grounds that he had been tried on evidence of earlier crimes rather than solely on the evidence of what had been done to Sarah. Basically, they were afraid that this would create too much bias for Roy to feel as though he got a fair trial, and they were not trying to risk an appeal based off of that. So much for being able to easily show that this was part of a larger pattern of behavior for Roy. And this meant that, for better or worse, the bulk of the prosecution's case would focus solely on the forensic evidence recovered from Roy's vehicle that they believed undeniably linked him to Sarah's abduction and to her murder. At trial, Lee was called to testify as to what he had seen following Sarah's disappearance, mainly regarding the man in the white van that he'd seen speeding from the scene. And while his testimony certainly was compelling, frustratingly, when asked to pick Roy out of a lineup, Lee was unable to do so. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that he's frustrating for not being able to do it. I'm just saying that the situation of it depending on him in any capacity, that's what's frustrating. The trauma that this boy had been through, coupled with the stress that he was likely feeling, knowing how important trying to make that identification was, he probably wouldn't have been able to pick his own photo out of a lineup at that point. So I feel so bad knowing that he had to go through that. Thankfully, though, outside of Lee's testimony, Sarah's siblings were held in a completely separate room from the trial so as not to be subjected to the actual gruesome details of what had happened to their sister. Best believe, though, that her parents, they were there and present every step of the way. They were beyond terrified that somehow, some way, this horrible man was going to figure out a way to skirt justice for what he had done to their daughter. In fact, Michael Payne was so worried that Roy would be acquitted that he was fully prepared to kill him himself if the courts didn't see to it that he was held accountable. And honestly, I have never related to anything so much in my entire life. People like Gary Plausch and Marianne Bachmeyer, that's the club I like to believe that I'd be in if anyone ever did anything to one of my kids. Thankfully, though, in this case specifically, things would not have to result to that. Because on December 12th, 2001, after 4 long weeks of testimony and presentation, Roy Whiting was found guilty of the abduction and the murder of 8-year-old Sarah Payne, for which he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. And while oftentimes in the UK, life doesn't really mean life in the sense that life means life here in the US, as in there are less than 100 people in the UK right now serving true life orders, as in they will die in prison, which is crazy when you consider that the US has almost 60,000 punitive much. At any rate, though, the judge in Roy's case did believe that his crime warranted a true life sentence, stating, quote, "You are every parent's and every grandparent's nightmare come true. You are and will remain an absolute menace to any little girl. It's one of the rare cases where I shall recommend to the appropriate authorities that you be kept in prison for the rest of your life, so that no further child is added to the list of your victims and the lives of a third family are not ruined." So, therefore, he imposed a minimum of 50 years for Roy to serve before he would be eligible for release at 92 years of age. And while, yes, Sarah and Michael were satisfied with Roy's conviction and his sentence to a degree, Sarah in particular just could not fight this nagging feeling in her gut that there was more to be done and that her fight still wasn't complete. She simply could not let this be it. She could not let her daughter's death be in vain. Not only did she want to make sure that her daughter's name and her daughter's legacy lived on, but she also wanted to do her part in ensuring that no family would ever have to go through the absolute nightmare that she and her family had just endured. If she could prevent even one additional child from meeting a horrific and untimely end in the way that her daughter had, then she would consider her mission a success. And so, pretty much as soon as the dust settled from Roy Whiting's trial, Sarah Payne dove head first into painstaking and excruciating research all surrounding the sex offender registry system in the UK at the time. She was 1,000% positive, without a doubt, that had she known that any registered sex offenders or pedophiles were living anywhere near where Sarah had been taken, she never would have let her children go off and play alone. Sarah never would have even had the opportunity to be abducted because she never would have let any of her children out of her sight that day. At the time of Sarah's abduction and murder, the information of those on the sex offender registry was kept confidential. These people and their horrible crimes and the danger they posed to society was just hidden away from the public, giving these monsters basically free rein to just move in the shadows. And to us now, especially anyone in the US, that probably sounds nuts when you think about the unfettered access that we have to the sex offender registry here. But what if I were to tell you it wasn't always like that? In fact, the idea of allowing public access to the sex offender registry wasn't even a concept here until 1994. So just over 30 years ago, and only 6 years prior to Sarah's murder. That'd be crazy, right? Well, believe it, because that's exactly how it was. Obviously, we know that all changed, but not without the fight of one very resilient family. So, it all started in July of 1994 when 7-year-old Megan Kenka was lured into the home of her 33-year-old neighbor, Jesse Timendikas, where he proceeded to rape and murder her before disposing of her body in a nearby park. Jesse was later arrested and tried for Megan's death, ultimately being found guilty of 8 separate charges, including intentional murder, felony kidnapping, 4 counts of aggravated sexual assault, and 2 counts of felony murder, causing a death in the course of certain specific felonies. Initially, he was sentenced to death. However, that sentence was later commuted to life without the possibility of parole in 2007. That's when New Jersey legislature abolished capital punishment in their state. And when all of this was said and done, much like Sarah's parents, Megan's parents were appalled to find out that they had been living next to a convicted child predator, and they had absolutely no idea. Again, like the Paynes, they were certain that had they known, they could have done more to protect their daughter. Had they known, they believe that it is highly likely that their daughter would still be here today. Enter Megan's Law. Just 1 month after Megan's murder, the New Jersey General Assembly passed a series of bills that would not only require law enforcement to notify the public when high-risk sex offenders moved into their area, so if they lived close, if they worked close, but it would also require that they maintain a sex offender registry that includes offenders' names, addresses, photos, incarceration dates, and details of their offense, or offenses. New Jersey passed its own version of Megan's Law in October 1994, less than 3 months after Megan's death, and then President Bill Clinton signed the federal version into law in May of 1996. So fast forward back to where we left off with the Payne family following Roy's conviction. Sarah specifically had come across Megan's Law during her own research into her country's sex offender registry process, and immediately she knew that they, over in the UK, they needed something just like it. She felt that had something like this been in effect prior to her daughter's murder, it would have undoubtedly saved her life. The official campaign for Sarah's Law was spearheaded by the News of the World newspaper, and it began in July of 2000 in direct response to Sarah's murder. Sarah's Law, which was named after Megan's Law, if passed, would set very similar requirements in the UK as had been passed in the US into motion. The aim of the campaign was for the government to allow controlled access to the public to the sex offender registry so that parents of young children could know if a sex offender lived anywhere in their area. Oh, and under the law, parents can also inquire about specific individuals who have any sort of regular access to their children. And not surprisingly, given the nation's reaction to what had happened to Sarah, the Sarah's Law campaign drew immense support almost instantaneously. A petition created by News of the World's managing editor, Stuart Kuttner, received close to 1 million signatures in almost record time, which is great. Not so great, though, was their public blast of some 100 pedophiles. This information being published in this fashion led to shock and disgust and outrage, which is warranted and justified, sure. But it also led to people just flat out rioting in the streets and trying to find these people and to enact their own sort of vigilante justice. And while obviously I'm aware that I said earlier in this video that people who hurt children have absolutely no place on this planet, which I stand by, but legally, what people were doing, it wasn't right. For starters, some of the people that ended up being targeted weren't even pedophiles. One guy was a pediatrician and people just got confused. So a big yikes there. But continuing to play devil's advocate, these registered sex offenders on this list have done their time. They've paid their debt, legally speaking. So while they are, yes, despicable monsters, the point of having access to the registry is not so you can go and burn these people's houses down and play judge, jury, and executioner. The point of having access to the registry is being able to be informed and to be equipped to protect your children and to educate them on how to stay safe. And listen, please hear me when I say that as a parent, I get it. I know where every sex offender around me lives, and it makes me physically ill. And I urge everyone to search their area and to keep themselves informed. Do I wish I could snap my fingers and they'd be gone? Yes. But speaking more pragmatically, that's just not how things work, unfortunately. Regardless of all of that, though, and despite the numerous people telling Sarah that she was wasting her time and that no way was she going to get any sort of law change like that, like what she was fighting for, in 2008, almost a decade after Sarah's tragic murder, 4 separate police forces rolled out a trial run of Sarah's Law. And then in 2011, the official program was rolled out all across England and Wales. So take that, naysayers who had the fucking gall to tell this grieving mother who was crusading for the safety of other children that she was wasting her time. Oh, and proving them even more wrong, Sarah actually went on to be awarded the MBE, or Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, by the Queen herself. Yeah, she was given this award in December of 2008 in response to the amazing work she did in helping to protect the nation's children following her daughter's death. But wait, there's more, because this woman is unstoppable. In 2004, she went on to publish a book entitled A Mother's Story, detailing Sarah's murder as well as her painstaking campaign for the passing of Sarah's Law. Like I said, all this is to say that Sarah Payne, she is an absolute force. Truly just a complete and total hero and freaking badass. Not even in the wake of a very serious stroke that she suffered in 2009 did Sarah slow down. I have said it before and I will never stop saying it. When these families can take these horrendous tragedies and use them to fuel a fire within them to help and to fight for change, it is truly one of the most incredible displays of human strength that I think we'll ever bear witness to. Unfortunately, though, while Sarah went in one direction with her grief, using it in all of the aforementioned ways, Michael, little Sarah's father, he went in the complete opposite direction. 3 years after Sarah was murdered, and after 18 years of marriage, Sarah and Michael actually ended up splitting up. I'm not sure the exact reason behind the divorce, but both Michael and Sarah later went on to note that their grief took a massive toll on their relationship. And then following their divorce, Michael pretty quickly spiraled into a severe depression, which he then self-medicated with alcohol, right up until October of 2014, when he was discovered dead in his flat by police following a request for a welfare check. The official police report of his death noted no suspicious circumstances, and it was believed that he died of alcohol-related illness several days before his body was found. He was just 45 years old. According to his family, he had spent the years preceding his death just drinking alone in his flat, absolutely plagued by depression and constantly blaming himself for what had happened to Sarah. It is heart-wrenching to think that he spent 14 years blaming himself and feeling responsible for what had happened to Sarah when, at the end of the day, the only person to blame for what had happened to Sarah was Roy. And what's even more infuriating is that schmuck was just sitting in prison, not feeling even the slightest ounce of guilt or remorse. In June 2004, Roy applied to the Court of Appeal for a reduction in his 50-year sentence. And grotesquely, in June of 2010, he got it. Yes, the high court judge ended up reducing his 50-year jail term by 10 years. So instead of being eligible for parole in 2051, when he's 92, he will now be eligible for parole in 2041, when he's 82. The only thing that keeps me from going absolutely mental about that reduction in his sentence is that I'm not really holding my breath on him making it that long. Mainly because I don't really care. I hope he dies in prison. But when I tell y'all that the other inmates hate this man, oh girl, do the other inmates hate this man. It seems like every couple of years, this man is attacked by other inmates. And while I know that it shouldn't, low-key, that makes me happy. I'm actually going to read them off to you quick so that you can bask in his misery with me. So on August 4th, 2002, he was attacked with a razor by another inmate while fetching hot water. In July 2011, he was attacked again. This time he was stabbed in the eye. Then he was attacked and stabbed again by 2 other inmates in November of 2018. And then finally, earlier this year in February 2024, he was stabbed again by another inmate. Listen, I know that it sounds bad for me to be laughing at the horrible things that people are doing to this man in prison, because realistically, prison itself is the punishment. In the grand scheme of things, inmates shouldn't have to fear for their lives while serving their time. But it's really no secret that all crimes against children, and especially sex crimes against children, are looked on extremely harshly in prison by the other inmates. So my thought process, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. And in this instance, when it comes to people who hurt children, that is everything that the time entails. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Rest in peace to poor Sarah. At just 8 years old, she should have been at the very beginning of her life, not the end of it. And just thinking of the fear and the terror she must have been feeling in those final moments, no one deserves that, but especially not a sweet, innocent child. She had so many experiences robbed from her, and so many experiences robbed from her family. She never got to graduate high school, to go to college, to fall in love. She'll never get to have a wedding or to have children of her own. Her poor mother even said in one interview I saw that since Sarah would never get to have a wedding, that is why she buried her in a white coffin and she had her carriage pulled by white horses. They did all of that in lieu of the wedding that she should have had the opportunity to have. It is so devastating what Sarah went through, and then as a result, what her family had to go through. Obviously, it had a catastrophic effect on Michael. He essentially blamed himself into an early grave over what happened to her. Sarah, although she channeled her grief into making positive change, she undoubtedly will never recover from what she's had to go through over the years. And then there's Sarah's siblings. Both Luke and Lee have been racked with guilt for all these decades, thinking that if they had just run faster and caught up to her, that maybe she would still be here today. That's guilt I can't even begin to fathom now as a full-grown adult, so having to grow up feeling that, I mean, not that they should have, it's obviously not their fault, but you can't help how you feel, and those must have been some incredibly difficult feelings to grapple with over all these years. And then there's Charlotte. She was only, I believe, 6 at the time that Sarah was killed, and given the trauma of the experience, she's gone on to say in interviews that she doesn't really remember all that much about the experience, which you would think would kind of be a blessing, but she actually feels guilty over that. Like her entire family was completely transformed and devastated by this, and sure, she was too, but I don't know, I guess she feels like she should be able to remember more about this event that completely tore apart their lives. Ultimately though, like I said before, none of them should feel guilty at all, because the only person to blame for what happened to Sarah was Roy, and thankfully for at least the next 16 to 17 years, he will for sure be rotting behind bars exactly where he belongs. And you know what? I hope he continues to get his ass beat every couple of years as a reminder of the horrific things he did to this poor, sweet, innocent little girl. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. And of course, one final big thank you to Dino for requesting this one. Ooh, and also a big thank you to Litha Light for requesting this look. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form I have linked in the description. And if by chance you're interested in anything about today's makeup, I will also make sure to have all of the information and links for the products I used today listed down there for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. The date of my next video should be listed here on the screen for you now. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye guys. West Sussex. The fuck is that? It's one of... What? Who? What? Oh my god, okay. Maniac. Turn this maniac about. This is a sentence I'm never gonna be able to fucking get out. Ow! Oh no. My skin looks like fucking garbage. Yeah. Real bad. It's real bad. I really should have shaved my mustache before I filmed this video. Hot diggity damn. Okay, American Idol. No. Fucking crusty ass lips, man. Still not great. Listen. Baby. Fuck. Without the possibility. Long months. Wait, what? Is that a fucking hair? Nope, just a wrinkle. Cute. We love that. Abolished capable. Did nobody invite you here, Fly? And it is... Scary. Oh my god, why is this still recording?